Here are the three primary tips for you to follow when considering the best telescope to purchase for kids. So, number one, don't buy a telescope just because it has the largest magnification power. Oftentimes, you see advertising from stores or maybe even on the box itself that talks about this high magnification power. Truth be told, high magnification power doesn't always mean it's a good telescope. So, that's tip number one. Don't be swayed just because it has the largest magnification power. Now, tip number two, take some time and learn a little bit about a telescope. You're going to make a purchase and you want to be a smart consumer about it. You wouldn't just buy a car blindly, you'd do some research. Well, the same holds true for a telescope. And there's two good reasons. The first is you want to be able to ask the right questions when you're considering and researching a telescope to purchase. And then secondly, you want to be able to understand what the responses are. So when you ask a salesperson questions about the telescope, you want to be able to understand their answer and make sure that it makes sense and that they're answering the question correctly. You're getting the information you need. And the third tip is don't buy a telescope just because it's on sale. If you've got two telescopes that you're looking at and you're just comparing on price, that's a bad thing. Now, everybody likes to save money, but don't just choose the lowest price and let that be the deciding factor for picking a telescope. So let's take a look at a five-step checklist that'll help you out when you're considering to buy a telescope. So number one, you want to pay attention to something called the aperture size. And in general, just as a general rule of thumb, the larger the aperture size, the better the telescope's capabilities will be. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a great telescope, but it means it has a little bit more capability. So if you're going to compare something, aperture size is one thing, one technical specification to consider. Now, step number two, you want to look at the stand or the tripod that is going to be holding up the telescope. And there's a very good reason for this. You're going to be using a telescope, or your child is going to be using a telescope, and you want to make sure that the stand holding the telescope is pretty sturdy. If it's flimsy or weak, any kind of vibration will cause the telescope to vibrate, and that will leave the child with a poor viewing experience. So you want to make sure it has a stable base, whether it's a stand or a tripod. So that's another consideration to be looked at. Now, step number three, look closely at the mounting hardware. Now, the mounting hardware is what attaches the telescope to the actual tripod or stand. You want to make sure that it's going to hold the telescope snugly and securely, but you also want to make sure that it's easy to use. If it's too difficult to use, then the child won't use it. It may be a need for an adult to set it up for them, and that's something you don't want to have to do. You want to make sure the child has a nice experience being able to set up the telescope right away and easily for themselves, and then be able to use it. Now, step number four, this one may seem like an obvious criteria, but some people overlook it. You want to make sure that the telescope you're looking for is appropriate for the age of the child that you're buying it for. Oftentimes we see that too little of a telescope is bought for an older child, or maybe too much of a telescope is spent and acquired for a younger child. You want to be able to find the right telescope based on the age of your child. And then lastly, you want to make sure you consider the different types of telescopes. You're going to hear terms like refracting, reflecting, and compound type telescopes, and each of them have advantages and disadvantages. We've got more information available that kind of explains that. If you want to see the information regarding the different types and some details, and also some reviews and recommendations for different types of telescopes, be sure to visit stargazingpro.com, where you'll find more information about picking and choosing a telescope, reviews, and a buyer's guide. I'll include a link below in the description to get you easy access to the site.